Hello, my name is Alexiou, and this is my presentation on environmental narrative. My interest in the topic is that I enjoy asset creation and have struggled in the past with making a space feel lived in rather than dressed as a set. To go over the thesis first, I will be focusing on the effect of how the environment is used in terms of narrative to produce an immersive experience. As for the definition, narrative design is a technique used in gaming to convey a story or information through a game's environment as opposed to dialogue or cutscenes. This focuses on the structure, terrain, placement of props outside of gameplay perspective, instead focusing on immersion and storytelling. As for what goes into it, there are two main things to consider: what the purpose of the space is and why things are placed the way they are. The first one is much easier, as most of the time is defined in large part by the game itself, and then broken down into subcategories based on necessity, such as a living room versus kitchen in a resource survival, or a lab versus storage area in a sci-fi horror. Each area is largely defined by the overarching structure, aka house and lab, yet the individual functions of rooms is what makes it feel like a real place. The second subject, why things are placed the way they are, is much harder to achieve, as you need to focus on what you're placing, where it is placed, and what style it has. It helps to have concept art for this part, as without it, you're kind of throwing darts at a wall until something sticks, and even then, the things that do stick may not be cohesive with one another. Another thing to consider is the narrative effect of time on the space, which can be broken down into four groups: where and what environment was, the original purpose of environment, if it is in use, reused, repurposed, or abandoned, and how the passage of time has affected the space. For the location, we could see two examples of production facilities, one set in a desert and another in a war-torn forest. The first, though abandoned, is more industrial, having been made as part of a wider infrastructure with the sole purpose of production. The second is militarized, in a dangerous location, defensible, not welcome, and can possibly operate separately from outside infrastructure. How time affects these environments is vastly different, as the military area will likely be looted by an opposing party, but its structure will remain intact, while the other will likely be vandalized. Next, we focus on purpose, with both examples being different rooms from the same game. Similarly to the previous example of purpose, the layout and prop placement of each room is determined by their intended purpose. However, time will likely affect each space differently, as the original layout will determine the location of things like structural points of integrity, outlets, water pipes, vents, etc., all of which are important to consider, especially for our next two topics. For certain aspects of usage, the original purpose and location are very important, as they determine what realistically can and cannot change about a setting. Take the first example. You're not going to get a nice skylight in the middle of an abandoned subway tunnel without something going drastically wrong. However, in the second example, you very well could with significantly less effort, accidental or otherwise. Repurposed locations can be difficult to work with, as you are now telling two stories in one. If done effectively, think of the underworld from Fallout 3. They make the player want to learn more rather than just walk through. Still in use locations can suffer a similar fate as repurposed, typically depending on the time since creation. With the example of the 700-year-old house, it would be understandably very outdated in terms of amenities and insulation, and as such, things would probably have been replaced. But as a designer, you need to think about what would be replaced, why it would be replaced, and when it was replaced. For condition, we have two obvious examples. In each scenario, a disaster led to the abandonment of the area, leading to the decay of each structure. In the first example, plant growth took over the once sterile laboratory setting, leading to a more natural or welcoming environment. In the second, the decay has been less inviting without the option for plant growth, with rust and shadows being the only accent pieces to a similarly once sterile-ish environment. The passage of time has affected each space differently, even if under a similarly original cause for abandonment. Here we have a nice looking environment, but an unrealistically laid out space. It's a research station. It looks feasible, a lot of thought put into infrastructure. However, there are structural issues, with three airlocks right next to each other. The second example is the tower from Destiny 1. Yes, intended as a temporary waiting area for the next mission, it was bland and lacked any form of character, with little to no dressing aside from the main points of function. In the third example, we have a lot of nothing placed in a space, with the intent of conveying collapse and disaster. However, there is no indication that people were ever in this space, such as lost personal objects, strewn rubbish, or, say, people for that matter. In the first example, we have the Destiny 2 tower. Though similarly designed as a temporary waiting area, and somewhat bland as well, the space feels more purposeful, with crates and signs of infrastructure nearby points of commerce. In the second example, we have a battlefield from XCOM 2, which tells a similar story that the previous slide's living space failed to, despite a similar lack of people. It has smaller debris, broken chairs, makeshift tables, board games, strewn about drinks. People clearly occupied this space at one point in time, even if they don't anymore. In summary, in order to properly tell the story of an environment, one has to think about several aspects: where a space was made and how that would affect the layout. One must consider the style of the setting and how that would restrict the options for a space. One must consider what it, what it was made to do and how it would best perform its job. One must consider how a space is currently used, and if it differs from its original job, how would that restrict the options or layout of the new job? One must also consider how an either limited or extended passage of time has affected the structure or condition of the space. And then finally, we have the bibliography.